Interesting recovery here for Bitcoin. Obviously, most of this is clearly coming from the S&P 500 sunshine. It is sitting at brand new all-time highs. There was a very, very small pullback here, which Bitcoin used to essentially take a massive shit and drop below 110K. But since the S&P 500 did manage to recover and get a little bit higher than that, we are now seeing Bitcoin get that recovery taking shape as well here, which is very, very interesting because we've got this massive sideways range here. It spans from 112 up to about 124. And this is a kind of new speculative zone for Bitcoin to be trading in. I think that what's really interesting for Bitcoin here is that if the S&P 500 keeps its gains, Bitcoin essentially is poised to get back to the top of this channel. And then, of course, potentially we can get a rejection and potentially we can get a support. And that's going to continue until obviously one of these levels break. And we'll get to all of those, later down the line kind of implications in a moment here in this video. If you're excited for it, if you're hyped for it, do me a favor and smash up those likes as you are coming into this video. Really appreciate all the support. But yeah, we have seen Bitcoin all the way down to basically 109 and, penetrating a little bit deeper into this general support zone. Now, as we knew very, very well on this YouTube channel, there are a ton of support levels for Bitcoin basically below 112 and above, let's say, like 98 somewhere here. And I've had the support lines drawn. I don't know where they're gone. But we had a ton of them drawn on these charts, and that basically illustrates all of those same levels as well. Now, that's really important kind of background for us to keep in mind, because if we know that there's a shitload of support that spans basically between these two yellow lines, that tells us that this is a really large zone that Bitcoin could see bounces in. And I know that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. A lot of people just want to say up or down and then, stick their finger in their nose and get on with their life. Obviously, unfortunately, as a trader, it's never really going to be that simple. There's always going to be a lot of nuanced discussions involved. A lot of people don't like having those nuanced discussions because they're poor or they want to stay poor, and that's okay if that's you. But if it's not you and you actually want to get very, very rich off these markets, you are going to have to entertain nuanced conversations. If you find that difficult, then you've already chosen your camp. And that's really important because Bitcoin paints large support areas for itself, and a lot of people don't want to accept that. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is that right now we're still quite bearish, right? We've essentially been bearish since 124K, but we really cemented that kind of bearish position with this backtest. We actually had two backtests at the same level here. This one right here, where the market managed to fall below this level and then get rejected and then fall lower still, and then even worse the second time around. And that clearly tells us that obviously a zone that was previously providing, quite reliable support for Bitcoin, even just days before we got rejected, it has now turned into also predictably a very reliable zone of resistance. And the reason I'm bringing that up is Bitcoin anywhere here, up until some of these price levels here, I'm saying like 115. Obviously, it's going to get a little bit more heated as we get into the 16s and the 17s. These are going to be levels that I'm expecting Bitcoin to struggle at if it continues to push higher, with one big exception, which is the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is paving the way, and ultimately, I had somebody ask me, because I did like an interview the other day. I had somebody ask me, what do I weigh the most in my analysis? Is it, trends? Is it horizontal levels? Is it the respect that we show to these horizontal levels, which are all, like, these three things are all very, very important in my opinion. But what I told him is it's actually none of those things. By far, the single most important kind of thing that I can use in my analysis is looking at the S&P 500, because the S&P 500 will pave the way. In fact, let's be clear, the very first thing I said is that there was a tiny drop here on the S&P 500, but what did it line up with for Bitcoin? Bitcoin, at that same time, fell down to its lows below 110K. Bitcoin broke market structure, and it lost this sideways parallel channel that it was in. We've already had it drawn out on this chart right here. We lost this channel. We broke market structure after topping out with somewhat of a blow-off top. Not really. It's not very extreme, but something similar to that. And that's all the while that the S&P 500, kind of just coughed, like it kind of just like, I can't even say it stumbled. It didn't even stumble, you know what I mean? But the reactions in crypto have been quite extreme. And, this all ties in with things like the fear and greed index, which, it's one metric, but it's something that's at least worth looking at, in my opinion. We've seen essentially a full reset now down to neutral territories right now. And yesterday and over the last week. We've been down in these kind of neutral territories for some time, but we're doing that with a Bitcoin that's still setting, a solid 12% above the $100,000 price level. So that's a pretty fucking good level to start seeing neutral sentiment coming in. And that's precisely my point, right? Like, nothing's actually changing in this market. Nothing is changing in a material sense. Nothing is telling us that, hey, we're not really in a good position anymore, and we need to start being worried. And yet the crypto market, being a bunch of emotional fucking teenage girls, is unable to retain any level of objectivity or balance in their minds with what the market might do. And that's largely because you're a bunch of fucking gambling degenerates, right? Obviously, we're all a bunch of fucking gambling degenerates, not just you. I'll count myself in that too. Obviously, that's going to be on a spectrum, and we're going to try and move away from that as much as possible. We want to be using processes, not gambling. But that's not going to stop the vast majority of the market from being degenerates. And I think that's really important, because that clearly tells us that in light of, and I don't even know why I got red lights playing right now, ladies and gents. This is not appropriate because the market's actually looking pretty sweet. So let's switch up the lights a little bit. The thing is about these markets now is we're at good levels, right? We're substantially above the 70K all-time high, which Bitcoin was stuck at for a very long time. We really are substantially above it, right? We topped out at like 70K, and now our all-time high is at 124, which is nearly a 2x. That's probably like an 80% increase or something like that. So incredible price move there after that long period of consolidation. This is in line with, like I said, the S&P 500 looking absolutely phenomenal as it is, with the rate cut news coming up, which means that there's a hype cycle that we can be dealing with right now as we approach, whatever day in September that happens, if it happens. The best thing for the market right now, by the way, is that rate cuts don't happen, because as soon as they happen, we lose that narrative. And clearly, this is a strong narrative for the market. Clearly, it's very important for the market. So, the market is probably going to start taking shits when the news actually drops, because now your hype, essentially has been removed from the market, right? Your source of hype. So I think that's really important, because if Powell does troll the world and delay those interest rate drops, it's gonna increase the time that we can speculate on interest rate drops, and that's gonna be great for traders. But bringing it back to where the market is itself, we're clearly still in a good place, right? By price, we're in a good place. If you're not an emotional bitch about it, we are in a good place. However, a lot of people don't accept that right now, and that's going to be a typical mark of this market cycle still being in early stages, right? The fact that you've got so many people and their grandmothers telling you that this market cycle is topping in a few months, you're probably saying it too, right? The fact that so many people are saying it is telling me that these people are going to end up getting blindsided. Something's going to happen where there's a massive pump. They're going to realize that they were sidelined, maybe a little bit too heavy in cash, whatever the deal may be. There's going to be a little bit of regret involved, and those people will end up buying back into the market. That's usually how it goes. That doesn't mean it has to happen now, but I've been doing this for 8 years. I've seen this shit play out a million times. That's how it usually goes. There are exceptions. This could be an exception. That's part of the game. If anything was definite, then being a trader wouldn't be so great anymore, because you wouldn't really make any money. If it was definite, everybody would have already, put money on that direction, and there would be limited upside. But it's not like that. Actually, the reality is that a lot of people just are not sensible, with how they view the markets. And so little drops like this happen for Bitcoin, and they shit the bed, right? They get everything twisted. And really, really start panicking. So I think that's important. I think that's really important stuff to keep in mind. That doesn't negate the fact that there's resistance up ahead for Bitcoin. But like I said, if the S&P 500 is going to be the core indicator for Bitcoin's performance, that's not making me feel worried about these resistance levels either. It's just something that we've got to watch out for. Using a few of my key indicators that I like to look at, for example, the Ichimoku cloud, we've got a pretty nasty zone of resistance that's forming right over our heads, and we're going to be meeting that resistance in a couple of days if nothing changes. So that could definitely result in, kind of rising up into this level and then kind of getting slammed down like that. that would be, you know, pretty clean as far as the Ichimoku cloud. But again, you need the S&P 500 to show us those signs of weakness for Bitcoin to actually take that tumble. Because at the end of the day, you know, Bitcoin compared to, you know, an index like the S&P 500 is still quite tiny, believe it or not. And so it's not going to be like the most accurate chart that we can look at for where things will go. Ultimately, we understand that the money that moves Bitcoin is the same money that moves traditional finance, and we can see what traditional finance is going to do with a much clearer outlook than Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is manipulated a lot more than traditional finance. It's a pretty simple, like, logical chain of reasoning, in my opinion. And it's the same logical chain of reasoning that I've been essentially, you know, molded to now for about 5 years, and it's served me incredibly well, better than anybody that denies it, clearly, because the correlation there is very, very clear. It's like a plus minus 1 or 2 month thing, right? Sometimes Bitcoin will lag behind, sometimes Bitcoin will kind of run ahead, but plus minus 1 or 2 months, Bitcoin and the S&P 500 will directionally always be moving in the same kind of way. And I think that makes it, you know, quite easy for us to do our jobs here. So now let's talk about Bitcoin getting rejected. If Bitcoin does get rejected, of course, we're penetrating deeper into this zone toward 98K, where the bottom of our support is. But that's not even truly the bottom of our support. We can draw this bitch all the way down to 92, 91. You know, and we've got tons of support all the way down here as well. I know that this sounds crazy, but we're in Bitcoin, okay? Bitcoin's a volatile asset, and that's just what things look like here. You might not like it, but then you're probably not so suited to these markets, because this is fucking normal. This is very normal for Bitcoin. In fact, if we fall all the way down there, that's going to be a 26% drop, which is not even, you know, the 31% drop that we saw here, or the other 30% drop that we saw here, okay, 34% here. So it'd still be, you know, a more modest correction than some of the corrections we've seen in the past. And I think that's really important to keep in mind so that we don't lose focus and lose sight of what this market has done so far. You know, a lot of people, when you start getting all-time high breakouts, they start getting massive tunnel vision on events like this. Even down here and even back up here, they get massive tunnel vision on this stuff. And so they forget that actually large-scale pullbacks can happen. But again, you know, it's a tough sell to see that happening with the S&P 500. But that's what I think would happen if Bitcoin did end up getting rejected again. Tons of support all throughout this range. It can find support anywhere in this range. Obviously, it's probably more likely that we stay above 100K, but I don't even want to, like, say that with too much certainty because, you know, like I said, Bitcoin pulls back. It just happens. It's just one of the realities of this market. So I don't even want to get too comfy with saying, you know, that 100 is kind of our floor and we're not going to drop below that. I think that's really, you know, a recipe for getting blindsided in crypto. We need to be open to these possibilities, especially the uncomfortable ones. But on the flip side, if Bitcoin does end up doing well from here and, you know, really capitalizing on the S&P 500 strength, then breaking these resistance levels shouldn't be too much of a problem. You know, they're good resistance levels. I mean, they're strong, right? They've been in play now for 42 days. This, you know, 117K level especially. That's a pretty decent amount of time, but that's still only a month and a half. And, you know, it's not like the 6-month, you know, resistance levels that Bitcoin had in the past. You know, like Bitcoin doesn't have any of those strong resistance levels anymore. We're just traumatized because we lived through them. But, you know, markets don't pay you for trauma, bro. Like, let's get real. Like, you need to keep that shit at the door and just retain objectivity. There are people that are absolutely slaying in these markets every single day, and you are not allowing yourself to be one of those people because you're too emotional about the market if we, you know, like slightly break market structure or whatever. Do you know what I'm saying? So resistance up here, I don't think it should be too much of a problem. And if Bitcoin can get above and more importantly flip it, get a back test like this, that kind of tells us we're golden. Obviously, this could go as high as, you know, 122 as I showed here, or it could go, you know, modestly only up to 119.5. But in any case, if we get a bounce off this level, that would be a pretty big deal for Bitcoin to kind of show us that it's actually looking pretty strong and looking pretty neat. Now, another thing that's kept me optimistic throughout this whole period is Bitcoin dominance, okay? We've covered this extensively on the channel, so shout out to those of you that are subscribed and viewing all of this content. But what we are seeing here pretty clearly, ladies and gents, is that even as Bitcoin is dumping, Bitcoin dominance stays low. Some of the key coins that we've been looking at, for example, Solana, is seeing a pretty decent breakout right now. It got a beautiful back test a couple days ago, and now it's flying against Bitcoin, which is really, really cool to see. Cardano has not woken up, but it's trying, so I think this is looking pretty sweet as well, honestly. Approaching some pretty nice buy levels for these kind of short to midterm outlooks now. And we're seeing the same across some other coins like XRP as well, right? Coming back down to this yellow line that hasn't failed as reliable support now for quite some time, for about a month. So that's also pretty nice to see. So, what this shows us is that people are still speculating on altcoins, right? Even altcoins that look a little bit weak are still looking decent. And that tells us a lot about the strength underlying in this market. You could read Bitcoin and you can say Bitcoin broke market structure. Okay, yeah, you're right. But we're also seeing investor appetite clearly looking pretty positive right now. But it's rumbles right now. It's happening underneath the ground. This is how big money moves. It's not, retail that tells, your fucking barber and your Uber driver about, XRP. It's not like that right now. But things are still moving. So what is that? Those are rumbles. Those are rumbles that are happening underneath the ground. They don't have to turn into anything. They could fail to materialize, and just it turns out that all these, smart people with big money that are buying coins right now are actually stupid, and they're going to get it wrong. That's happened before. It's possible. But it's not super likely, not in my opinion. I think that, that display of investor confidence lining up with the investor confidence in the S&P 500, those are two very compelling factors that tell us that actually this market is looking pretty optimistic, even if Bitcoin's breaking market structure. Ultimately, you've got like 3-4 really strong pieces of evidence looking bullish. And then you've got the one minor thing that Bitcoin did, which is that it had a deviation below support. And we already understand how Bitcoin's deviations work. Bitcoin pulls off deviations every single day. Like, I don't know, like a normal person changes clothes. You know what I mean? It's like a normal thing for Bitcoin to just pull off deviations. And so, they can't be too worrying to us at this stage. That's going to slow us down, and that's going to make us kind of lose perspective of the realities of this market. And that's a very costly mistake to make in market cycles like where we are right now. So I think we're actually looking pretty good. I think we've been looking pretty good for a while. As long as the S&P 500's pointed up, I'm going to keep on saying that. If I see evidence of this kind of positive correlation changing, I'll talk about it. But right now, the worst criticism you can make for Bitcoin is that it's underperforming against the S&P 500, and that criticism falls apart when you keep in mind what I said earlier, which is that this positive correlation works plus minus 1 or 2 months, right? So it can take Bitcoin a little bit of time to catch up with the S&P 500, but it always does, and there are no exceptions to that. So I think that that's looking pretty sweet overall. There actually are exceptions, like when the FTX crash happened, but those are more black swan events, and it still ended up regaining that positive correlation after a few months anyway. So even in the worst examples of where I'm wrong here, I'm still right. You know what I mean? In terms of what I'm saying, it's not even about me. I'm just making my point that the point that there's a positive correlation is still true, even when it looks most untrue. And I think that's really, really important for us to keep in mind, because it just lines up with logic, ladies and gents. We already know that, the same money that moves TradFi is the same money that moves Bitcoin. So brilliant stuff there. Ethereum against Bitcoin has not managed to, continue to materialize on this aggressive move up. And it's actually starting to take a little dip down here now, which is fine. It's no big deal. Let's take a look at Total 3 real quick and see if Total 3 tells us anything interesting. Yeah, Total 3 is looking decent. Total 2 probably dropping a tiny bit right now. Yeah, basically the same chart overall. And then Total itself probably looking also pretty decent. It's not looking particularly hard to come up with bearish ideas about this market. This basically shows us all of crypto. I think Total 2 probably a better outlook, and obviously this excludes Bitcoin, and really what we're seeing is consolidation at an all-time high. So you and I are pretty useful to seeing consolidations at all-time high at this stage. We've seen this quite a lot. We've seen this happen regularly throughout this market cycle, where the price gets up to a resistance level or it gets up to an all-time high, and then it just kind of trades sideways for a little bit. We've seen that happening a lot, and that has consistently resulted in breakouts to the upside as well. So is it going to happen now? Again, that's where, being a trader comes in, and essentially you are always playing probabilities. but the probabilities look pretty good. All we have are probabilities, of course. If we think that we have any definites, then we're probably lying to ourselves. And yet, even with that in mind, things are looking pretty sweet, in my opinion here. So I'm liking the look of this. If you are as well, let me know what you're thinking in the comments. If you're not, let me know what you're thinking in the comments. And of course, check out the links in the description down below. We've got a phenomenal coaching program. It lasts 12 weeks. It's one-to-one, highly exclusive. It is expensive, but incredible results. Everyone that's ever joined has turned incredible results and paid off their fee within the first couple of weeks of joining. And if you want to be one of those people, then you can reach out and we'll see if you're a good fit. A member of the team will get back to you. Of course, you've got some beautiful links in the description to some of the best exchanges in the game. Check them out if you're not from a restricted region. But otherwise, hit up those likes, subscribe, tick the bell, do all that good stuff. And we will see you all in the next one.